35 years ago, our community was shaken by a series of homicides committed by Danny Rolling. My office represented two of the families in civil wrongful death cases. Today we're taking a closer look at the criminal case in the complex world of forensic psychology with someone who understands it from the inside. I'm Jack Fine, an attorney here in Gainesville, and in this special episode, I'm joined by Dr. Harry Krop, one of the most experienced forensic psychologists in the country. Dr. Krop evaluated Danny Rolling early in the case, before Rolling was ever publicly identified as a suspect, and his involvement offers a rare first-hand perspective. But Dr. Krop's background extends far beyond that. Over the course of his career, he has evaluated more than 2,000 individuals involved in serious criminal cases and has testified in hundreds of trials, including some of the most high-profile cases in recent history. He's conducted evaluations of individuals like Ted Bundy, Casey Anthony, and Eileen Wuornos, and has worked across every major area of forensic psychology. His expertise has been sought by both the defense and the state, and his work has played a role in determining everything from treatment to life sentences to death penalty outcomes. In our conversation, Dr. Krop explains how he first encountered Danny Rolling before Rolling was ever publicly identified as a suspect, the ethical and emotional weight of hearing Rolling's confession under a confidential evaluation, why Rolling did not meet the legal standard for insanity, and how childhood trauma and personality disorders can shape violent behavior as well as the limits of mitigation in a case of this magnitude. It is a rare opportunity to hear from someone with this depth of insight. So with that, let's turn now to my full interview with Dr. Harry Krop. Let me turn to the Danny Rolling situation. I did talk with you a few minutes this morning and learned some things that I didn't know before. Let's start with how you got involved in the first place.
Okay. Usually when I do a murder case, I'm hired by the defendant's public defender to do the evaluation, and usually in almost all cases it's a confidential evaluation. If I'm retained by the defense, it doesn't have to be a public defender, but the defense attorney, it's almost exclusively confidential in a death penalty case. In this case, it was somewhat different in that Danny Rolling, when I first saw him, was not a suspect. He was not accused. He was not yet a suspect in the Gainesville homicides. He was in Ocala, which is Marion County, about 35 miles south of Gainesville, and he was charged with an armed robbery.
So why are you contacted, or who contacted you to do what with this armed robber in the Marion County Jail?
Well, as I said, I do a lot of work in other counties besides Alachua County. I do a lot in Marion County. And the chief assistant public defender called me up on a Friday, late afternoon, and said, I have somebody that's been arrested and charged with an armed robbery, and there's something sort of weird or strange about him. I can't quite make it out. I don't know whether he's competent, but I'd like you to see him as soon as possible. His name is Danny Rolling. She said, I already got a court order appointing you as a, quote, confidential expert. So I have it in writing that it's confidential. And the only other person that knows, of course, is the judge. And I said, well, how about if I go down on Monday? And she said, is there any way you could see him this weekend?
That's asking a lot.
Yeah. You guys often ask a lot. But anyway, I was certainly willing to do that. And I specifically remember because my car was getting fixed and I drove my wife's car. And just as an aside, my wife is also a therapist and essentially a partner in my practice. And that's important, and I'll bring that up later. So I drove her car for a change. There was plenty of parking, not very many people doing evaluations or seeing their clients on a Saturday. And I went to see Danny, and they bring him out in a private room outside of the pod.
Where's the lawyer? Are you with the lawyer
No,
who's sitting? So
I'm
how did that happen then?
I I have a key to I'm given a key when I get there to go into an office, which is called the public defender's office, so that I don't have to go in the pod where there's lots and lots of other inmates. And unless the person is considered a security risk, they just let the person come out in the hallway and see me. At that point, little did they know, but Danny was not considered a security risk. He had not been a management problem at the jail. He had only been in jail a few days.
Perceptive on the part of the assistant public defender who interviewed him or interacted with him to immediately call in a psychologist.
Yeah. And when you're doing an insanity case, um, the astute attorney who with experience knows that the sooner the mental health professional sees the defendant, the more likelihood that they'll get a better picture of what the person is like, rather than having him sit in jail for a couple of weeks, maybe stabilizes on medication or something like that. So the sooner the better in a lot of the cases. Um, so as I said, I sat down, I introduced myself. Danny said that the attorney uh, told him that I would be coming and that it was confidential. And so he seemed, for whatever reason, to trust me right off the bat. But in any event, we talked for about an hour and 15 minutes about the robbery that he was charged with, which is about the amount of time one uses to evaluate somebody for competency.
And are you using any sort of testing instruments at that point, or is this basically a just one-on-one conversation about, do you understand what a judge does and what a lawyer does and
Yeah,
that kind of thing?
just like you and me. We're sitting,
Okay.
except there's a desk between us and no cameras.
Okay.
Um, so I told him what the purpose was, to evaluate him, to see what his mental state was like. And he said, and he was very, very anxious. And I still remember he had rashes all over his face and his arms, and was very, very anxious, but at the same time, eager to talk. So we talked a little bit about his history. I knew where he was from, I knew his education. He told me that he had been in prison before. He didn't tell me like where he had come from or where he was going. He just said on the outskirts of Marion County, he pulled a robbery, he had no money, he was homeless, and so forth. And so we talked, and it was clear to me that although he may have had a psychiatric disorder, I didn't see anything obvious. I just saw him as a highly anxious but very intelligent individual. And so we concluded the interview. I told him that I was going to tell the attorney I thought he was competent, but that the attorney may want me to see him again, perhaps regarding his mental state at the time of the offense being the robbery at that
And what
time.
was his reaction when you said, I'm going to find you competent? Did he have a problem with that at all?
No, I stood up to leave, put my folders in my pack, and he put up his arm and said, "Hold on, can you stay a few more minutes? I have something else to tell you." And I said, "Sure." And he said, um, "Is everything I tell you confidential, even if it's not about this case?" And I explained to him the ethical statutes of a psychologist in Florida is that he could tell me anything, that it would still be confidential, other than that he was going to go out and harm somebody or kill somebody or hurt somebody. And I told him if it meant me knowing that he was going to do something like that, I would have to tell the potential victim. He said, "That's fine. I've already hurt somebody." I sat down, and for the next 3+ hours, I sat there with, maybe of those 3 hours, 10 minutes of it was questioning. The rest of it was just him telling me how, when, not why, but how and when he killed the 5 students. He said, "I'm the one they're looking for." And I didn't know whether he was just showing off, because there are other people. In fact, there was somebody at that time, I think in the West Palm Beach area, that had been put in jail as a suspect of the
Yeah,
murder
he may have
cases.
been, I'm not sure if they jailed him or questioned him or what, but I know there was another
Yeah,
suspect. His
somebody
picture
named
was in the
Humphrey.
paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I knew that. I didn't know all the details of
And he
that,
turned out to be completely innocent.
obviously.
Okay.
Um, so Danny then went in, as I said, start talking from the beginning about how he was coming down on a bus, got off the bus in Gainesville, mainly because he had no money left. And that's as far as he could go on the bus. He was living in the woods, and began to tell me in detail, I mean, graphic detail, to the point where I basically was just looking and listening and couldn't say very much more. And he went into detail about, not only did he go into detail about killing 4 female students, the male student, but he also volunteered without, again, me asking, that he had killed 3 people in Louisiana before he even came. So all of a sudden, I know who this person really is, and that he killed 8 people, including the 5 Gainesville homicides.
And your head must have been spinning, but I don't want to lead you with my questions. What was your reaction as you got up to go and drove home? What is in your brain at that point?
I remember it's interesting how, we all remember things that are very traumatic in our lives, and we remember where we were and how we felt, such as like 9/11, things like that. I remember going out of the jail, giving my pass back, giving the key back, and just sitting in my wife's car holding the steering wheel. And I was really numb for about 10 or 15 minutes. I called my wife, Dawn, and said, "I got a lot to talk about. I'll be home soon." And I went, because she said, "What took you so long?" I said, "I'll tell you when I got home." So,
You don't normally spend like 4 hours doing an
not a
incompetency
competency
evaluation.
evaluation, no. Um, I drove home and I took her aside and we sat down in a private room. And again, because she's a partner in my practice, I'm able to talk, thank goodness, because I was able then to uh, sort of relieve myself, just like Danny relieved himself by talking to me. And he told me, he said, "I really am glad I got this out. I've never told anybody before." And he did actually say, "I appreciate your listening and not judging me." I mean, little did he know what was in my head, because I tried to, just listen. Um, so I told my wife, and then I had a 9-year-old daughter. I still have a daughter who's now 44, but she was 9 at the time. And she sort of knew what I did for a living, and I taught her what confidentiality was. But I told her, and again, let me back up a second. Living in Gainesville, like everybody else, and I'm sure you remember what was going on at that time, everybody in Gainesville was scared. I was scared to go out and walk my dog, always looking over my shoulder, especially at night, because we had no idea who this person was, whether they were still in Gainesville. The killings had stopped several weeks, but yeah, I clearly remember it was during orientation week, and parents were bringing especially their daughters home from Gainesville. I remember being interviewed by CNN. They were down here with their trucks while all this spree was going on. They were talking to me because they knew I was a forensic psychologist, asking me about profiling and stuff like that. So everybody in Gainesville was part of this um, anxiety
And
time.
I remember just driving and looking around at people as I'm driving, and everyone's looking at each other, and everyone was on edge.
Right. And
The whole town
I
was
even
on edge.
remember in our closet, we had a nanny who was about maybe a 26-year-old and was, babysitting part-time for my daughter. And I remember one afternoon or one evening reaching up on a shelf in my closet, and I felt something that wasn't supposed to be there. And I looked at it, and it was a gun. And I heard that lots of people were buying guns, but this nanny was not supposed to be bringing a gun into our house. And of course, we talked about that. But that leading into that night, um, when my daughter was getting ready for bed and I was reading her a book, and in the last several weeks, she was asking either my wife or I to sort of look under the bed before she went to sleep. And I said, good news, I don't have to look under the bed anymore. The bad person is not going to come and the bad person is caught. I didn't tell her anything else, but whether that's ethical or not, I felt that I was being a good parent by relieving some of her anxiety.
So what I learned earlier today is you took some other steps aside from talking to your wife and partner. You took some other steps about talking to some other people about your ethical responsibilities in this situation. Can you
Right.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time I've ever been in this kind of situation. And so I knew that it was confidential, even to the point where it was um, a court-ordered confidential evaluation. But I had concerns that here this person is not a suspect yet, or might never be. And at some point, he's probably going to get out of jail. I also was aware that this alleged suspect down in southern Florida was being questioned about being the killer. And so I had these ethical concerns about what I should do. I just had this information that I felt that I needed to find out whether, what I could do essentially. So I went and I spoke to the chief judge, and I spoke to a state attorney who I trusted. I didn't tell them anything about who I interviewed or where the interview took place. I just told them that I was involved in a case where I had these concerns that the person could be violent, etc. Uh, I told them that the evaluation obviously was confidential, and what can I do hypothetically? And they both shared.
So wait, so you're in, was it the judge's chamber or the state attorney's office, or where were you? Was this in person or on the phone?
On the phone with the judge and in the office with the state attorney, two
Okay.
separate times. Um, again, I didn't have anybody in Gainesville. The public defender's office was not yet involved because he was not a suspect yet. So both of them very quickly gave me the same responses. It's confidential. They also talked about the duty to warn. I said, I'm aware of that. And they said, you can't tell anybody.
So would the duty of warn been triggered if he somehow got released at that point? Was that their thought?
No,
Or
only if I specifically knew that he was going to go out and he was going to go to this person's house and do something bad.
and you got the same advice from both the state attorney and the chief judge
Yes.
separately?
Yes.
Those are two separate occasions.
Yes. So I
Okay.
felt more comfortable in my own skin, at least, that I can just sit back and wait and see what happens. And something did happen.
Okay. And tell us about how you got involved subsequently.
Subsequently, and I can't remember how much time went on, but evidence was gathered that Danny Rolling became a suspect. They found some information in the woods, I believe, possibly a diary or something like that.
There was reading some materials because my brain didn't recollect all this stuff before this meeting here today. Apparently, there were some tips given to law enforcement, and they did find his lair out in the woods, and there were some DNA comparisons or blood
Right.
work done.
There was somebody from Louisiana, I think, who called and
Yes.
said what happened in Gainesville was somewhat similar to what happened in Louisiana. But in any event, he became a suspect. He was arrested. He was transferred to the Alachua County Jail. And so now the Alachua County Public Defenders became involved in defending Danny Rolling. And I got a call from the chief assistant, Johnny Kearns, saying, we have someone who has been charged with the Gainesville homicide. We would like you to evaluate him, as I did in many other cases for the public defender's office. And I felt the need to tell them that I already knew Danny and have evaluated him. And I was told, yes, they knew that because Danny told them that they couldn't remember my name. Danny couldn't remember her name, but he said, I was evaluated in Marion County by somebody that described me, and I trust him, and I'd like him to be involved. So again, I probably would have been asked to get involved anyway, but I felt obligated to tell the public defender that I already knew Danny to see whether that was any type of conflict.
And I actually interned for John Kearns, so I know him well. He was a terrific lawyer.
Excellent.
Did this conversation occur over the phone, or was this in person when you're telling him, yes, I know
That
Danny
was,
Rawling told me he did it?
yeah, I believe. I didn't tell Johnny Kearns that he told me everything about the case. I just told him that I had evaluated him.
Okay.
I didn't tell him what he had told me about the Gainesville homicides. But in any event, I believe Johnny and I talked by phone, and then we met at my office. And at that point, I elaborated what he had already told me. And at that time, Johnny had sent me police reports and some discovery. It was early in the case, but he had some discovery about the how they and why they arrested Danny.
So did you ever see Danny Rawling personally again after the Marion encounter in the Alachua County Jail?
Yes, I saw him several times in the Alachua County Jail. I think, and I think you reminded me in my testimony, I believe I indicated that I spent about between 20 and 25 hours with Danny altogether, just interviewing him, either either in Marion County Jail, the Alachua County Jail, or eventually at either Florida State Prison or Union Correctional Institution. I can't remember exactly, but I knew it was in Bradford County, and that he had either pled to or was convicted of the Marion County case. So he was then sent to the prison for that case.
So he was put in prison even before the Gainesville trial happened, or the
Yes.
Gainesville, whatever you want to call it,
Yes.
because he eventually pled. Did you ever reach a psychological diagnosis of Mr. Rawling?
Yes. There were some initial diagnoses that were fairly easy based on his history. Again, I found him competent in Marion County. I also found him competent for the current case. So that was sort of right off the bat. So the next step was to look at his mental state at the time of the offenses. And also, again, if they were seeking the death penalty, which they decided very early on that they were going to seek the death penalty in this case for obvious reasons. So I knew my role primarily at that time would be to determine whether there's any mitigation to explore with the jury.
So it sounds like early on you determined that this was not going to be an insanity defense type of case. And why is that? What rules out the insanity defense when you're interviewing a defendant?
Well, again, it was in part, I mean, I don't usually go into an initial interview of a defendant, which the Alachua County sort of was an initial interview related to formally of this case. I usually wouldn't go in with a predetermination that the person was sane or not sane, but I had already spent over 3 hours with him talking about the case, and there was nothing that he shared with me that suggested that he had a major mental illness and that the killings were a function of that major mental illness.
Well, if he doesn't have a major mental illness, what does he have? If you could elaborate just a little bit for the layperson on what the difference is between a major mental illness and, I don't know, is it a personality disorder, or what is the diagnosis, and how is that not a major mental illness?
The major mental illnesses that are usually required, I guess, to have an insanity defense, as I mentioned, from the legal standpoint, the person is not able to appreciate the wrongfulness
Right.
of his actions. I mean, that's sort of a simple definition. And usually individuals who are determined to be insane, either by the mental health professional and ultimately by the court or jury, are individuals who are psychotic, that they are out of touch with reality, that common diagnoses are some form of schizophrenia, some type of person perhaps in a manic state who is not really in control of his behavior and so forth. So it was clear to me that he didn't have those psychiatric disorders. What was also clear to me, uh, not only from the beginning, but also after I spoke to Danny, is he did have personality disorders. Now, that's a disorder that is a formal diagnosis, but it's more reflecting characterological deficits rather than psychiatric disorders. Some of the common personality disorders are one of the most common is antisocial personality disorder. We see these individuals who have prior criminal histories, who lack taking responsibility for their actions, who do repeated things even though the consequences are negative and so forth. And so we call those individuals psychopaths. That's not a diagnosis. That formal diagnosis is antisocial personality disorder, but they have these psychopathic traits, the irresponsibility, the poor impulse control, and things like that. And it was clear from just talking to Danny before I did any testing, which I did later, which supported my sort of clinical impressions that he had psychopathic traits. There was no remorse at that point in time for the victims in the case. It was all about Danny. That's all he cared about, despite the fact that he wreaked havoc on the entire community, on numerous families, and certainly the way he um, the way he killed these young people. I also diagnosed him as a having a sadistic personality, or what we call sadistic paraphilia, which is a type of sexually deviant behavior. So he had several of these personality disorders,
And
which don't help a whole lot in terms of mitigation, but it's pretty much all we got.
okay. And what we're referring to, or what you may have been referring to, is the fact that he posed them and he's cutting off pieces or doing whatever he's doing. And is that what paraphilic personality means? What
It's
does
not a
that mean?
paraphilia. It's a paraphilia or a paraphilic disorder is a form of sexually deviant behavior. In his case, it was sadistic, which is a specific type of paraphilia. And there was no question based on, as you just said, the nature and the way he killed these individuals. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that as intelligent as Danny was, um, and as methodical as he was in terms of killing these people, he left, when he went back to his campsite, he realized that he left his wallet at one of the victims' apartments. And so he went back immediately. Uh, no, this was the middle of the night. He went back to the apartment. No one had been there yet.
So
No
he
one had
returned to the
discovered.
murder
He
scene.
returned to the murder scene to find his wallet. He found his wallet. I'd probably rather not get into the sadistic, but that's the person that he posed and so forth. So he didn't do that immediately. And again, that just shows um, the type of deviant kind of um, person that Danny was. And I say that, I'm sort of editorializing here because I try and be as objective as possible with any of the cases, and I do my best professionally to try and help the attorney with the client. But as much as I tried to maintain my objectivity with Danny, it was very difficult because of, as I talked before, about how personally he affected me, my family, and so many other people in the Gainesville community.
Can we contrast? What I'd like to do is go into causation a little bit, which is a very difficult question, but can we contrast his lack of remorse or his sadistic behavior with someone like Eileen Wuornos, another serial killer that you had a lot of interaction with?
Right.
Are they all the same, or are there differences?
Eileen Wuornos and Danny Rowling, in my opinion, were totally different. They were both, mass murderers. Um, or serial, killers, I guess would be more appropriate for them because they were done at different times. But and anybody who has seen the movie, the monster knows some of the things that was about Eileen Wuornos and knows some of the things that she went through as a kid, which were very significant contributors. She also showed remorse, although it didn't appear that way when she went to trial, but she did, in my opinion. And I felt a form of sympathy, despite she killed 7 people. Danny, I never really felt sympathy for. I tried to understand Danny. There were a lot of family dynamics which contributed to Danny being Danny. But the fact that he was still all about him throughout my time with him, it was hard to feel empathic with him. He never felt empathic with any of the victims.
So is it nature? Is it genetics? Is it nurture? What is the cause of the sadism or lack of empathy or whatever these horrible personality characteristics were? Were you able to ascertain in any way what is it in their background that's causing this behavior?
Well, let me get into a little bit about Danny's background.
Okay.
That's important, and especially when you talk about sadism. There was, in my opinion, sadism in his family, not of a sexual nature. You can be sadistic and not be a sexual sadist. Um, Danny grew up in a very dysfunctional family. I interviewed Danny's father and mother. The father was not an easy person to interview.
You know, he had been shot by Danny, or there was some interaction with him that was negative, I
Danny's
remember.
father shot Danny when on his way to the bus station to leave the town because he had gotten into a really bad they got into a bad argument together. So Danny leaving to eventually end up in Gainesville, he has this in the back of his mind. He also left because his wife, who by the way looked a lot like the female victims in Gainesville, and that's sort of another dynamic. Um, so Danny left his home in a very angry and depressed uh, way because of his wife and his father. Um, the father was in law enforcement, and um, one of the interesting dynamics here is that the father was very OCD, very set in his ways. He was known for being very tough in law enforcement, but he was also very tough with his family.
And OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder.
Yes, I don't know
Okay.
if he was diagnosed that way, but he was very compulsive. That like things done exactly the way he wanted them, which was he comes home for dinner, he wants the paper on the table, and he wants his food ready to be served. And he also, more importantly, doesn't want to be bothered by anybody else in the family. So that was one of the first things that Danny told me when I started talking about his case in Louisiana, which he was never charged with, and that was part of the plea agreement. They would not charge him with the Louisiana
There was
homicides.
three murders he
There's
did
a
in
family,
Louisiana.
a husband, a wife, and their, I think, teenage daughter, if I'm not mistaken. And it's relevant because Danny didn't start off as a sexual sadist or even a sexual deviant. But because of the dynamics between him and his father, Danny never had an opportunity to sit down his family like a quote, what we would call a traditional normal family sitting together, asking how their day went, stuff like that. Can I help you with your homework? That didn't take place in the Rawling home. So Danny, while the father was eating and the mother was probably in the kitchen, would go around his neighborhood and he would look in windows, not for sexual gratification, but to watch families eat together.
And you learn this is what he's telling you,
Yes.
basically. Okay.
But it sounded very real to me. And the mother, of course, who we interviewed, who never intervened because of her passivity. And what's notable is the mother had terminal cancer. So she was not able to come down and testify. Uh, the public defender's office videotaped her interview, but she had talked to me. And I learned that, yes, he would leave and so forth. They didn't know he was going around looking in windows, but this is I learned from Danny. So he would look in windows of various families eating dinner or just eating and having conversations. And one night or one evening, he was going to one of the families that he would watch, and he sort of accidentally looked in a window of a woman, one of the daughter, taking a shower. And after that, he started going around the neighborhood and other neighborhoods looking in windows, specifically getting sexual gratification from his sexual voyeurism, which then resulted in him breaking into that family's house in Louisiana and raping the young woman and killing the other two family members. And that was really the beginning of his becoming a sexual, sadistic murderer.
I'm still not, I don't want to say I'm not satisfied with that explanation, but is there a, is, is there a tendency genetically to that? Or is it just his home life was so terrible? Or do we not know exactly the components that go into causing someone to engage in such deviant behavior?
That's a good question and a fair one. We didn't know back then what we know now about things that contribute to not only homicidal behavior, but mental illness, drug use, criminal behavior in general. And the research clearly demonstrates that there are 10, possibly more than 10, what we call adverse childhood experiences that are defined as substance abuse in the family, criminal history in the family, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence within the family. And there are some others, and these are considered what we call adverse childhood experiences. And what we have found through the literature is that the quantity of adverse childhood experiences, and some could be violence in the neighborhood and things like that, emotional neglect. I didn't mention neglect, that's one of the other ones. The more of those adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, the more likely that a person will get involved in criminal behavior, will get involved in substance abuse, will have mental health issues. So we now know a lot more than we did back in 1990 in terms of some of the contributors. When you look at Danny's life, there was clearly neglect, there was clearly domestic violence, there was physical abuse. And then he had more physical abuse when he went to prison, which is again another side that we could talk about, but he was sentenced to prison in Mississippi in one of the harshest penitentiaries in the country, known for sadistic corrections officers and so forth. And the first thing when I finally tried to get into why Danny picked the number of people that he did to kill, he indicated that he wanted to kill as many people as the number of years that he spent in that penitentiary. Whether that's something that he came up with later, whether that's one of the reasons why after he left Gainesville, he went to Tampa. He actually dated several women who later, when questioned, said, oh, he was so nice and he read poetry to me and sang songs with his guitar. Danny said, well, I already had killed the number of people that I meant to kill. Now, again, whether this is all for show afterwards, we do know that, as I said before, I had no evidence to suggest that he was insane at the time in question. But as time went on and he started getting more attention and people wanted to write about him, and
This is after he's been convicted and it's all come out.
right now I'm talking about while he was still in the Alachua County Jail,
Okay.
he's coming up with various reasons why maybe he wasn't emotionally stable when he killed these people. He's starting to realize hey, I could be executed. And so he's coming up with different reasons, different things to tell uh, myself and another psychologist who was also hired by the defense, Dr. McMahon. And that's when he came up with the Gemini defense.
And I noticed the Gemini defense from the um, book that he tried to publish that we were able to stop from being published. He seemed to shift back and forth between first person and third person. And Gemini made me do it, but I'm doing it because of these 8 years that I spent in prison. Um, was there ever any consideration in your mind of some sort of multiple personality disorder kind of thing, which is maybe what he was trying to do, talking about Gemini doing the murders, but I don't know. You can elaborate
Well,
on that a little
once
bit.
once he started with the Gemini thing, his public defenders obviously said, "Can you take more of a look at what his mental state was like? Do we have any kind of insanity defense?"
And your
And
answer was,
my
or
answer,
what you did.
yeah, there are certain tests that we use for malingering, which is faking that you have some, in this case, faking that you have a mental illness for some type of secondary gain, some type of benefit. The whole Gemini thing didn't come out until a long time after the evaluation started. And of course, even when he made his confession to when he was in prison and he made his confession, I don't think Gemini was part of that confession, if I recall correctly. So this was something that either another inmate suggested to him, perhaps not specifically Gemini, but hey, maybe you should try and look more mentally ill. That's not uncommon among inmates. Um, or it's just something that he came up with himself. But I never, again, I try and maintain my objectivity, but given everything else that he had told me, I felt the whole Gemini thing was just something. He was becoming more and more scared, and I think he was facing reality of what's going to happen to him likely. So that's where I think Gemini came from.
So was it a situation where you went back to his attorneys, whether it was John Kearns or someone else, and said, no, that's not gonna fly. I'm not gonna give you an insanity defense in this
Right.
case.
That was my opinion.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about, does he fit a particular profile, or how does profiling work in this situation? And you indicated that every case is sort of different that you evaluate. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Um, well, it's just that I've done so many cases. And yes, there are some common denominators. We already talked about the adverse childhood experiences. Um, that certainly, I mean, there are some, for example, homicides that result on a situation that goes bad. Somebody going in to rob a 7-Eleven, um, something happens, the person panics, he happens to have a gun, and he shoots somebody. He would be charged with or he could be charged with first-degree murder because he was committing a felony,
Right.
even if it wasn't premeditated. That's another way of defining first-degree murder. Somebody that's sitting out in a car, the getaway driver. This incident happens where an accident, not an accidental shooting, but an impulsive shooting. That person in the car can be charged with first-degree murder. So I've had so many different scenarios. Um, uh, sure, some of the people are psychopaths. That's often a risk factor involved.
And what's your definition of a psychopath?
Well, it's what we now call diagnostically an antisocial personality disorder. A person who, as a teenager, or before it says goes to a certain age, he may light fires for fun, for excitement. He may torture cats. And there's these other what we call conduct disordered symptoms or behaviors. The person has problems with impulse control. The person doesn't consider the consequences. The person has no empathy for others. Those are all psychopathic traits. It doesn't mean they're going to go out and murder somebody, but that's probably the biggest common denominator among those people who do kill. And then the family dynamics. In Danny's case, we had an emotionally and physically abusive father who I would consider uh, somewhat sadistic in the way he treated Danny. Never showed love, never showed affection. So we have those kind of family dynamics.
So is it the children sort of learn the modeling of the behavior that's inflicted on them?
Certainly that's in many cases, it's the environment, the learning. There may be some genetic components. There may be something wrong with that person's brain. We know now, for example, and im- this didn't necessarily apply to Danny's case, except for the fact that his first case where he went to prison, he was pretty young. And we know now that the brain of an adolescent is very different than a brain of a mature adult, which is why we don't execute juveniles anymore. We know that the part of the brain, which is called the frontal lobe, which is responsible for impulse control, inhibition, problem solving, judgment, it's why 16-year-olds can get behind the wheel and drive, 80, 90 miles an hour, not thinking about the possible consequences, because that part of the brain is not developed yet. And we know now, because we have imaging techniques and ways of studying the brain, that especially in males, that part of the brain doesn't develop sometimes till they're 23, 24 years old. Females mature much at a much younger age than males. I think we all know that.
But I'm still not sure we've answered the question of what, if anything, sort of tips you over the edge into criminal homicidal behavior, um, whether you're young or not, or have adverse childhood events or not. Um, are we able to identify the most specific triggers for this kind of stuff, or do we just have to sort of generalize and look at each case, or look at each case individually?
Well, I think we look at each case individually, but again, there's those common denominators that when we're looking to explore mitigation, we look at how old a person was when they first got in the system. And then there's, everything sort of snowballs from them, which is from then, that's what happened to Danny. When you ask me the question in terms of looking at each individual, when I testified for Danny, um, obviously the jury didn't believe or didn't feel that whatever mitigation I testified about wasn't sufficient for him to be spared the death penalty. I couldn't get into the fact that he was born a certain way with a certain brain and that this is something that he didn't have control over. The best I could do with Danny was talk about what I'm talking to you about, family dynamics, um, and that's, dysfunctionality with him growing up, that he never had a positive male role model, things like that. Drugs were not a significant issue with him. Um, I guess a prosecutor in one case, when I was going over mitigation, the one prosecutor said to me, "Isn't it true, Dr. Krop, that some people are just mean and they're born that way?" And I guess I had to look at her. I didn't feel that way.
Was this in this case or in a
No,
different
this is
case?
another case because I still
Okay.
remember. And I said, "Yeah, some people are mean." And maybe that could apply to Danny. I'd like to think that there's psychological dynamics, or I wouldn't have testified to those, but they were certainly not the same as when I testified for Eileen Wuornos. I went into all the different reasons why I thought she should not get the death penalty. Um, Obviously, in Danny, I didn't have a whole lot. When I go back and look at my testimony on cross-examination, which was by Rod Smith, the prosecutor, who didn't have a lot. It wasn't a very difficult job for Rod because of the nature of the crimes, which is often the main reason, no matter what there is in mitigation. The nature of the crimes is the primary factor that a jury considers. And in this case, there couldn't have been a worse, you know, nature of the crime to jury. If I were on that jury, I probably would have, even though I'm not getting into politics, I was once asked whether I believe in the death penalty, and the attorney objected, and I didn't have to answer that because my personal feelings shouldn't have any impact. But hypothetically, if I were on that jury, I certainly would have understood. And in fact, one person voted not to give the death penalty, but it didn't have to be unanimous back then. But there wasn't a whole lot.
And based on our conversation earlier today, I learned that the presiding judge in the trial who issued the death penalty, Stan Morris, who's a brilliant criminal lawyer and
Excellent.
judge, a very imposing personality, was one of the people that you spoke to get advice early on in the case about your ethical duties. Am
Yeah.
I right about that?
Yeah, I didn't realize the connection, but and I don't know still whether he ever
Whether he
put
made the
that
connection.
together. Yeah, but
Oh,
in
he's pretty smart, so I bet he made the connection.
But in any event, it was, the jury voted 10-1 or 11-1 to give him the death penalty.
And I will say it's a small town. I know the participants in the trial, and it was sort of like a dream team you got the judge with the most knowledge of criminal law, and he had a tenured law professor, Jerry Bennett, as his law clerk in that case. And the defense lawyer was excellent as well. We've already talked about John
One of the
Kearns.
best and one of the best state attorneys, but the state attorney, in my opinion, had a pretty easy
Shooting fish in a
job.
barrel to
And
a certain extent.
I remember when I looked, I think the case was covered by Court TV, and I went back and looked at it, my testimony and my cross-examination. I felt I did reasonably well on the direct examination, but all Rod Smith had to do on cross-examination was, Dr. Krop, isn't it true that Mr. Rowling told you he did this? Isn't it true that he told you? And I looked at Mr. Kearns like, get me out of this. But I remember saying, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And, I try to be as honest as possible when I testify. And there wasn't much that I could say on their cross-examination that was very helpful to Mr. Rowling.
Did you ever see Denny Rowling after the guilty verdict or the death sentence was announced?
No, and I wasn't there when the judge sentenced him. I did hear from him. He asked me if I would be willing to, when a person's being executed, they have a right to ask X number of people to come and be in the audience, I guess. And I was asked to witness that, and I chose not to. And 2 times I've been asked, and both times I've declined. I don't feel like that's my role anymore.
Dr. Krop, I just want to thank you for your willingness to talk with us about the case.
My pleasure.
As we close, I want to take a moment to shift our focus back to what matters most. While our conversation today centered on the psychology of Danny Rowling and Dr. Krop's involvement in the case, we never want to lose sight of the true heart of this tragedy. 5 young people, full of promise, potential, and bright futures, had their lives taken far too soon. Their families, their friends, and this entire community carry that loss every day. The impact of these crimes did not end in the courtroom. It lives on in the memories of those who love them and in the lasting imprint they left on Gainesville. Whether through the memorial wall, through stories shared by those who knew them, or simply through quiet remembrance, it's important that we continue to honor their lives and keep their memories alive. To the families, we extend our deepest compassion. We recognize your strength, your pain, and the legacy your loved ones will always hold in this community. Thank you for joining us.